We'll make a start. So hello everyone, my name's Trent Bartlett. I'm the General Manager of the Food, Retail and Supply Chain sector at BSI Group. And I'd like to give you a very warm welcome to today's webinar, Cybersecurity in the Food Industry, a Growing Threat. A very important and very topical subject, and we've got some great speakers who are going to share their thoughts with us today. First of all, in the spirit of reconciliation, BSI Group acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. You've joined the webinar in listen-only mode, but you're very welcome to ask questions, and we really encourage that using the question box. So Alexa, I think just if we can move to the next slide, I think there's some instructions on how to use the question box. So we will endeavour, we've got a time allocated at the end, and I think Alexa, we've just lost the slide there. If you can pop that back on. We will answer all the questions that we can in the allocated time at the end of today. Any that we don't have time to answer, we'll be still providing responses and send that to you sometime after the session. We'll also be sharing the recording with you as well. We have a couple of polls coming up in today's session as well, so really encourage you to provide your responses through to that. Just gives us a better feel for who's in the audience and what your current situation is, and makes the session a little bit more interactive as well. And I'm just going to give you a quick introduction to each of them. So first of all, Dushyant Sanathara is a seasoned business development professional specialising in information security and quality management systems. As a general manager at BSI Group, he leads the growth strategy in the healthcare, finance and ICT sectors across APAC, helping organisations protect their sensitive data and minimise risk. Charlie Hales, the Managing Director of Waterstones Australia, is a veteran in the technology industry with a focus on aerospace engineering and cybersecurity. She's known for her innovative leadership style, prioritising customer needs and fostering the development of the Australian team through training and mentoring. Bernie Brooks is an accomplished Managing Director and CEO with extensive expertise in retail, supply chain management and human resources. He excels in leading organisational change and international ventures, serving on advisory boards and chairing organisations in the retail, artificial intelligence and agricultural innovation sectors. And Todd Redwood, as our Global Food and Retail Managing Director, brings 30 years of experience in the food industry. He drives market entry, growth and compliance globally, overseeing BSI's solutions for sustainability, digital trust, health and safety and product quality in the food and retail sector. Now, as I said, we've got a couple of polls that we'll be working through in today's session. And the first of those is about to come up on the screen now. So are you aware of any cyber breaches that have happened in the food industry in the past 12 months? So pick one of three responses if you could. So we have, yes, it's impacted your business directly. Yes, it's impacted your partners or your supply chain or customers without directly being a breach in your business, or no, you're not aware of any issues to date. So if you can provide a response to those, that would be great. I think maybe unsurprisingly, it's impacted people's supply chain or their customers that they're selling to or other stakeholders. So thanks very much for that, and appreciate you providing a response, everyone in the audience. I'm now going to hand across to Dushyant, who's our first speaker today. So across to you, Dushyant. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Trent. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I want to touch on food industry from a risk perspective. But before I talk about the food safety culture and the way we've evolved over a period of time, I think I want to touch on an example from World War II. If you're aware, in the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942, German tanks were ready to fire and fight the battle with the Allies and in Russia, and with Russians specifically in this case. And there was a specific group of tank operators who wanted to fire the tanks, and they realized that out of 104 tanks, they could not fire any. And they were not sure what was going on, but the engineers quickly realized that there was a problem and the tanks were malfunctioned. And the malfunction was caused by the field mice, because they had nested inside, chewed through the insulation protection and the electrical systems. The example here clearly cites and is cited by one of the famous book by Morgan Housel called Psychology of Money, but it talks about unforeseen risks and the evolution of risks in today's DNA world, cybersecurity being one of the main ones. On to the next slide, please. So if you look at the risks in the food industry, yes, we are aware of microbiological risk. We do take care of foreign object risks. Food quality is one of an important aspect that we battle through, and we do it really well. And so is food defense in some cases, and supply chain risk. And if you notice, in last about 20 years, allergen tolerance has been growing, and that's a risk as well. And we as an industry have taken that into account, and certainly are very good at it. But having said that, the risks are still evolving, and one of the major risks that we are seeing now in the industry is sustainability, for sure, especially with looking at the climate risks and the hottest days that we observed in earlier this week across the globe. 2 days on a trot, Monday being beaten by Tuesday earlier this week, and the second one being the cybersecurity risk. And when we talk about cybersecurity as a risk, we know that it is here to stay. It is definitely not going away. Next slide, please. And when we look at these impacts and we try and realize what are some of the challenges that we may face, and it could be something like an IP risk or theft of intellectual property of a particular proprietary recipe. Imagine Coca-Cola lost their proprietary recipe to a cyber incident, or disruption to the operations, or a reputational damage to the brand, and that thereby losing a large customer base, or in some cases having regulatory or legal consequences. And there are also chances where someone can manipulate the way you operate and your systems through OT devices and realize that there is a potential harm that can be caused to public health deliberately. So these are the challenges that we as an industry are facing, and it's evolving. The point here is that yes, we are aware of the traditional food safety risks, but we need to expand an horizon and look at the evolution of those risks, and cybersecurity being a key one, a key part of what we do and how we do, especially when we are actively making our businesses move towards digitization. Thank you. Thanks, Trent.
Thank you, Dushyant. Thanks very much for that. And look, it's a good point. Obviously, risks evolve, or our perception of risks evolve, and things that weren't on the radar 20, 30 years ago certainly very much are so now. Just following on from that, we're going to run our second poll now. And the question on this one is, given there's been so many breaches across all facets of industry in the last 12 to 18 months within Australia, have you taken steps to improve cybersecurity as a result of these? So you're able to select multiple responses here in this particular poll. So have you made some improvements to your internal cyber controls? Have you perhaps engaged consultants to reduce risk? Have you pursued certification, or have you not made any changes to date? So again, kindly ask that you enter any relevant responses for your business into that poll. And again, I'll just give you kind of 15 seconds or so to do that, and we'll have a look at some results in a moment. Okay, just a few more seconds. All right, Alexa, Crystal, how are we looking there?
I think just a second and it will show. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So, look, many people have made improvements, and some of those improvements could have been quite simple ones in terms of password complexity and strength, the requirements to renew passwords, control of access to different PC terminals and that kind of thing. So that's the majority of responses there. Some people have engaged consultants. Not too many have. We know it's possibly more with some of the bigger businesses at present that are embarking on certification, or those that need to provide that through to, say, global customers. But we'll talk about that a little bit more in the presentations coming up, and a few people not acting at this stage. So thank you very much again for providing the responses. I'm now going to hand over to our next speaker, who is Charlie Hale. So across to you, Charlie. Thank you.
Thanks, Trent, and thanks to everyone joining today. So yeah, I'm Charlie Hales. Thanks for that introduction earlier. And it's interesting to see some of the polls there, especially the first one, because I'm now going to walk through a real world example, obviously anonymized, not going to cover any details about what business it was or businesses they were that were attacked. But basically to go through what happened, interestingly, to two direct competitors at exactly the same time, and then sort of what they did about it, how they reacted and things, with some lessons learned for some takeaways for you guys. So to explain a little bit about what happened, at the same time, early hours of a Friday morning, both organizations noticed that they were getting a crypto locker, which, for any that don't know what that means, it's basically all of your data across your organization is starting to be encrypted and you can't access it. So obviously when that happens, it's very important that we react quickly. Some of this stuff was found out later down the line, but it turns out that the attacker had been in both environments for a number of months. And that's important to remember, and an important point I wanted to call out, because that's usually what happens when an attack happens. When you first notice an attack, isn't the first time usually that someone's breached your organization. They've usually been there for quite a while, setting everything up and making sure they can do as much damage as possible, unfortunately. They try and put things in place to make sure that the companies can't recover from systems. So it's where the technology and the protection you put around yourself is really important so that you can recover when something like this happens. At the same time as the crypto locker kicking off, ransoms were sent to both organizations, basically saying that data had been taken from both organizations and they were going to use it to share with third parties if they didn't pay the ransom, and also that they wouldn't be able to recover from the crypto locker and get their data back themselves, so they needed to pay the bills. Again, this came out later, but again, to sort of cover the example of what happened here start to finish, it turns out that the way the hackers got in and the data was leaked was by using third-party credentials. So there was a little mention of third-party earlier, but you can put all the little thing from that is you can put all the protections in place around that. But if your third parties don't, and they have administrative credentials to your organization, which unfortunately this third party had, then they can bypass security that you put in place. Organization one, again anonymized, was well prepared. I wouldn't say everything was perfect, but they were definitely on their cyber journey, and cyber two was not. So that's where on the next slide we'll have a look at sort of what happened, how they'd prepared, and what the next steps were. So organization one, we've got a lot more information around this one. They had implemented a good cyber program, and again, an important point to note here, it wasn't just about implementing really good technology. We're a technology business, so that is part of the picture and important, but you have to make sure you look at the bigger picture here. It's about looking after the people and the processes as well. Because, for example, you can put the best technology in the world, but if you haven't trained your users and they click that link, or a third party as well gives that information, people can bypass technology. The other thing would relate to your processes. If you don't understand where your data is, how it's processed through your organization, you can't protect it properly. So it's really important to look at the bigger picture and make sure you've got that program covering them all in place. They developed some really good continuity plans and what we call run books. You may have seen Claire O'Neill talking about war games and things like that in the news. It's similar to that. So it's basically doing the roundtable exercises and what you will do as an organization when an attack occurs. You can develop multiple of those because it depends on, you know, what type of attack it is, who needs to do what, who you need to speak to, what you need to be protected against and things like that. They partnered with a 24/7 cyber organization. So one of the points on the first slide, it was early hours of a Friday morning when these Australian companies were attacked. Hackers unfortunately know that it's best to attack out of hours. They think that's the best opportunity they've got when someone's not watching the system, so they can do as much damage as possible before someone notices. But it's very important that the reaction's there when it needs it 24/7. And they had very good cyber insurance in place as well. That's something that's getting harder and harder these days to get in place, but having good cyber insurance for when an attack happens and you partner with them to create the run books, know what you need to do and things like that are very important. Organization 2, unfortunately, I don't have a huge amount of information about their setup, but if we move on to the next slide, we can see what the next steps were. So yeah, this sort of goes into sort of what the responses were and some of the impacts and effects to the organization. So organization 1, that attack had been stopped and contained within 13 minutes. So 13 minutes is still quite a long time. You know, if it stopped instantly would be ideal, but you can't protect yourself against absolutely everything. The continuity plans were implemented very promptly. So while everything was being contained, those continuity plans had already been enacted. People were getting woken up, protections were putting in place, comms teams were getting put together and things like that. The other thing that's very important that people need to remember, they need to prepare for if something like this happens, that you need to be able to maintain the evidence. So that sandboxed evidence I'm talking about there, that has to be something that's kept in a bubble and protected so that forensics and insurance claims and things like that can happen. Because we've seen, unfortunately, people come to us after an attack and they haven't done that. They've recovered systems over the top if something has been breached. So a piece of advice there is make sure you don't do that and destroy the evidence if you're ever recovering from anything like this. And they worked with partners across insurance, legal, and their 24/7 cyber partner and their communications teams on that response. And that included everything from the technical response, getting them back online, through to what they needed to do from forensics and what had actually happened. Legal, you know, what they needed to do, what they needed to disclose, the information commissioner, and also, you know, what they needed to speak to clients about if there was any issues with data. There was an effective identification of what data hadn't been exfiltrated. So that leads back to the point I made earlier. It's critical you understand your data and where it is, the important data. You know, what others were talking about earlier, you know, if you really understand where your IP is, what's critical to your business, what could do reputational damage, as Dushyant was saying, then you can protect that bit. It doesn't matter about any publicly accessible information. And critical systems were back up and running before Monday trading. So while they had the downtime on the Friday and the weekend, they were back up and running by the Monday morning. Organisation 2, unfortunately, was off for at least 2 weeks. They lost a full 2 weeks of trading, and even at that point, they were having issues with getting some critical functions running. They lost a lot of clients to Organisation 1, and they did receive quite a few fines because they couldn't meet contractual obligations. So they had certain orders that they had to fulfill within a timely manner, and because they couldn't fill that, they lost the clients, the business, and had fines. So there was quite a lot of reputational damage there. And this sort of just shows, with just that preparedness for the same attack, how it can go two very different ways. And if you could go on to the next slide, please. So some key takeaways. So this would be recommendations for anyone on the call. No matter where you are on the journey, you might have some of this really well thought out and in place. You might have some really good technical controls, or as we saw in poll number 2, you may just be starting your journey or have put some things in place. It's it's about not just putting that protection to try and stop it happening, it's making sure you're prepared for when it does happen as well. As I mentioned earlier, there's all the talk of the war games with key critical infrastructure in the news. That's those desktop exercises, run books and plans, so when something does happen, large or small, because they'll be very different in what they are. And you don't go to the nth degree creating a million different run books or plans for when it happens, but knowing whose responsibility it is for what they need to do and when, who can make those decisions, and how you can protect yourselves when something like this is happening, and communicate effectively to clients and any legal disclosures you need to do is very important. Back to the point of how these breaches happened, third-party due diligence is a must. So a lot of you in poll 1, I think it was, said you'd heard about breaches in third parties, clients or customers. And it's not saying you need to do audits on all of them and, you know, do a ton of work. Simple checklists that you can create in advance to send to those third parties to check they've got the right procedures and controls in place can really help protect your business as well. And then also think about the whole picture. So while you need to put some good technology in place to look at this, think of the processes, think about where your data is, think about how it flows through your organization and third parties, and protect those bits. You don't need to put massive technical controls around everything in your organization, just the bits that are really important to you and would really impact your business. And also train your people. So again, I mentioned this earlier, you can put the best technology in place in your world, but someone clicks that link, or accidentally puts their credentials somewhere they shouldn't, or doesn't manage passwords effectively, then that can give someone the keys to your kingdom, unfortunately. And the other thing I'd say as well regarding to people, one thing we've found very effective recently, and what a lot of people are talking about, is build the right cyber culture in your organization. And that is not a culture of fear around don't click this link or anything happens. It's around the education of what people need to do. And actually, if you make a mistake, everybody's human. That's okay. These things can happen. If you make a mistake, yes, you've done the training and stuff. We'll maybe do a bit of retraining to happen again, but shout up about it. Because if we know something's been breached, or if we know some credentials could have been leaked, actually we can fix that problem before anything gets really bad. So that's something that I'd recommend everyone has a think about. The other thing I'd say is not everyone can be an expert in this. You can go to a lot of people historically have thought this is IT's problem. And while technology IT people are very good, finding a cyber partner who can really work with you wherever you are in your journey. You might have a big cyber team as well, which is great, but just someone who can help with that external advice and making sure you're keeping up to date with relevant threats and information, and helping make sure you've got your right strategy in place. And then back to sort of my first point, and I can't hammer this home enough, because if you don't plan for your response and how you're going to recover, it can take you a lot longer, even if you've got the right technology in place. If you haven't planned to be able to recover your backups because they're immutable, which means, and sorry, I'm getting technical now, I won't say that again, but basically inaccessible, and so they can't be changed if a hacker does breach your organization, then you are not going to be best placed to recover yourself effectively. So that's everything that I had to say. Thank you very much for listening. And if anyone's got any questions, happy to answer them later. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Charlie. And just, thank you for the reminder there that if you can enter any questions into the question box, and we'll endeavour to get those, get to those at the end of the session. I think the point that may have raised a few alarm bells there in Charlie's presentation is business 2 that was down for 2 weeks. So it's worth probably reflecting for everyone in the audience, what would that mean for your business if you weren't able to trade for 2 weeks while your cyber issues were sorted out? So obviously potentially devastating circumstances there. I'll now hand across to Bernie for his presentation. So across to you, Bernie.
Yeah, thanks, Trent. And I think some really sound words there from Charlie. So, and they'll emboss quite well in some of the comments I have. I'm going to take the focus of what it means from a board point of view, and there's no doubt the board is really sort of on the hook in this regard. I'm fortunate enough in regard to cybersecurity, maybe unfortunate enough to chair or executive chair 6 companies. One of those is being listed, and believe me, this is probably the most topical thing over the last few months. And I think where we've seen a lot of potential investors look at things such as your economics, they might look at your social consciousness. They might look at your sustainability. I think the time. I would add that I think the board implications are significant. If you look at the table in front of you, one interesting part is the fact that it actually grew with significance over a period of time. In other words, it got worse for the company from the point of view of their enterprise value. And so the first comment is the significant impact it can have on the enterprise value of a company. The second is what I would call a sort of self-protection aspect, where you've got to look at it from the perspective of self-protection, and you can see the number of CEOs in the US that actually lost their job, maybe not immediately, but within 6 to 12 months after the breach. And I think it's about investor confidence that certainly plays a role. And I think we will see whereas sustainability plays a role, whereas your economics play a role, whether your social consciousness play a role, it'll move forward to the extent of what cybersecurity that you have. Let's move to the next slide, where I'll give you an Australian example, and specifically what has happened in regard to Optus. And I think a lot of us are aware of the Optus breach. And so I'll quote here from the Australian, where $140 million has had to be set aside for not only the protection and the identity in regard to documents, etc. We've still got to deal with 100 former and current Optus customers that have formed a class action. But look at the enterprise value deterioration that's occurred for Optus, down from some potentially 4.5 billion to 3.3 billion. So it has an enormous implication in regard to the data breach, and an enormous implication in regard to the reputation of that company. Let's now move to the implications for a board from what I would call governance, and more importantly, the web of law. So we'll go to the next slide, and you can see firstly that it's covered by a number of acts and a number of important acts. Can we move to the next slide, please? Firstly, there's the web of law and governance, and that's obviously extensive. The Corporations Act, I think, really reads, and I'm going to quote this: "The directive ignores the real possibility of an incident may be liable for failing to exercise their duties of care and diligence." And so the 6 or 7 boards I have, we reckon that this is the main topical component that's important at every board meeting. And it really also, interestingly, is seen as a foreseeable risk. So in many ways, you're on the hook because you should have had the foresight to protect, similar to some of the comments that were made by Charlie earlier today. And then there's the fiduciary implications, investor confidence. You've got company devaluation, which I talked about, the credit rating of a company. What about the number of customers you might lose, and also the loss of confidence in contracts, and not to mention fine and penalties. There is a penalty that goes to up to $50 million, or 30% of the company's adjusted turnover. You might say that that's a fairly sizable chunk of change from a fine. My comment is that I'm not sure whether adding a fine to the distress you've already been is the right way to go, but I would think that there needs to be some degree of protection and guarantee that it isn't going to happen again. But certainly, if you talk about being on the hook, that $50 million fine, as well as the Corporations Act, is very significant. But then if you move to the next slide, you'll see it's also covered by a number of other governance issues. You've got the Privacy Act obligations, in what's called a notifiable data breach. You've got the Australian Federal Police in regard to the Crimes Act, because they need to be informed and be active in the evaluation as well. You've got workplace health and safety, where people have put through enormous degrees of stress, whether that's dealing with customers or whether that's trying to solve the problem in an IT perspective. To ACSC, you've also got to disclose, not to mention the one I've talked about, which is to ASIC as well, because they'll now put you on a watching brief to make sure that you've got the strategy and the governance in place. So it's quite significant. If you move to the next slide, you'll see the other implication from the board, which is that I would call the cyber insurance issue, or the protection cost. If we can just have a look at the next slide. 72% of Australian listed companies have actually taken up the cyber insurance. 72% is quite a significant number, but the 28% that haven't is largely because they may have trouble getting it. There are a limited number of brokers available. We've got a lot of issue in regard to claims blowout. And for those of us who have gone through the process of trying to secure cyber insurance, you'll understand the significant costs that it's got. If we can look at the next slide, please. You've also got an issue where the risk of policies being withdrawn from the market as more insertions occur. So I think a lot of the insurance companies will look at their insurance policy and potentially withdraw them from the market, as they have done. We're seeing difficulty in directors and officers insurance, in posi insurance. And so I think we'll now see a significant issue in that regard as well. My last point that I'd make, and if I can get the last slide up, is just talk through the board implications and what are the questions that a board member should ask. And so firstly, it's to undertake simulations and penetration testing. Very, very important. I had one company that we did everything was fine according to the IT chief. Sure enough, we did penetration testing and uncovered a number of significant problems there. You've got to have an independent assessment of threat and vulnerability as well. So you've got to get somebody independent to do it. You've got to have the board meeting involved in formal governance. You've certainly got to have, as I think Charlie mentioned, incident response practices. And practices means rehearsal. What happens if this happens? What happens if that happens? And it should be on every board agenda. You've also got to have a risk management cyber program. Most boards are responsible for risk management, so include the risk register, the cyber program as well. You've certainly got to question third parties because there are a large number of third parties involved. And Charlie mentioned the number of insertions that can occur, particularly through third parties as well. And that might be as simple getting access to administrative role to an individual outside the organisation. And the two other areas is really the post-incident planning. If you do get an incident, what is it you're going to do? And my last comment is, I think has been demonstrated by a lot of recent examples, you've got to ask the question, why do you collect the data? And why do you hang on to it for so long? Because it is make it a lot more logical as you go through and look at cybersecurity, that you effectively look at it and say, why did I collect the data? And why did I hang on to that data for tens and tens of years, which created more havoc for us if there is in fact an insertion? Hopefully that gives you a couple of views. I think the key point is that 77% of Australian CIOs feel unprepared from a recent study, and that's quite scary. I think there's a long way to go in this space. It's going to become something that's got higher and higher on the hit parade or the top 20 in regard to boards. It's certainly going to be something that's really important because of the obligation you have. And there are some ways that not necessarily preventable, but will certainly alleviate some of the concerns that the board, shareholders, and your staff have. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Bernie. Great insight there. And I noticed you've raised the point about third parties, as did Charlie. And I guess that underlines the point that a business doesn't exist purely in isolation. It's not just about securing your own house. It's the implications of the parties that you deal with and your supply chains. We all exist in an ecosystem, and any element that is vulnerable passes vulnerability on to everyone in that chain. So thank you very much for that, Bernie. I'll now hand across to Todd Redwood. So over to you, Todd. Thank you.
Thank you, Trent. I'm hoping you can hear me clearly.
Yes, we've got you. Thank you.
I'll assume we can. Great, good. Okay, yeah, if you can advance the slide. Thanks, Alexa. So just to set the scene here, BSI in EMEA Europe, Middle East, Africa, did a survey of a lot of businesses and asking a similar question that we asked at the beginning of the webinar about, do you see cybersecurity as a risk to the business? And 83% of the food sector respondents across EMEA that we were dealing with said yes, they did. So it was an overwhelming result there, saying that they saw it as critically important. If we go to the next slide, we then asked, is cybersecurity the domain of who? And some said IT, about less than a quarter of them, around a third said that it's the responsibility of senior management, and half of them said it's the technical QA department. When we were talking, this is specifically in the food industry. But the reality is that cyber resilience is everyone's domain. It's everyone's responsibility. And while people are actually the weakest part of the link here, or the weakest link in cybersecurity, they're also the strength. So if I go on the back of some of the stuff that I heard Charlie talking about before, and talking about training people and having people aware, not scaring people, but making people aware and making people competent to be able to identify threats. This is very important. So it's everyone's responsibility ultimately, but there are certain parts of the organisation that are more responsible than others for putting in place the necessary parts of that cybersecurity or cyber resilience culture. Next slide, please. So if we have a look at the landscape we're dealing with, data breaches are up around 10-fold globally. 50% of the food manufacturing industry is software dependent, so therefore there's a vulnerability. Ransomware has become a new business model in effect. There are people that make their money out of going out and causing trouble for others. So on to the next slide. If we talk about a concept we call food defense, and then thread that with digital trust. Two different concepts, but having a look at the similarities here and how they work together. Food defense is about protecting the food supply chain from intentional acts of contamination, adulteration, or sabotage. Effectively, protecting from food terrorism of some kind of sort, and so preventing deliberate attacks on the food supply chain. Digital trust is the confidence and the reliability placed around the digital systems, the technologies, the data, and encompassing our digital assets, which protect sensitive information, safeguard us against unauthorized access or malicious activity. So digital trust is a very important element of food defense. Moving to the next slide, please, and having a look at the relationship between the two of those and the elements within. So we have data security, which is that security of the data related to the food production and the supply chain. So, like Bernie was saying, up and down the supply chain, the relationships that we have, the traceability and transparency, so enhancing that. So, the digitization of our supply chain helps us get more visibility, but of course it connects us to, more potential threats. Cybersecurity in itself, to protect our critical systems, and then also our ability to respond to incidents. So, it becomes very crucial when we're responding to issues that occur. Moving to the next slide. So, cybersecurity is a critical part, as I said, of food defense. We, as an industry, in the food industry, are incredibly vulnerable. We noticed how vulnerable we were from a supply chain perspective through the pandemic, where there were some breakdowns, not from a cyber perspective, but we saw how weak the supply chain can be at times. So it's really critical that cybersecurity is built into the food safety program and the hazard planning process as critical steps. BSI published a standard called a PAS, a publicly available specification called PAS 96. 2017 version is the fourth iteration of it. The reason I'm bringing this up here, other than the fact that this is a great guide about how to go about protecting food from food terrorism of all sorts, but this is going under a rewrite at the moment. So working with UK government and UK Food Standards Agency to rewrite it and amplify the cybersecurity elements within it, because we've realised that the food industry is particularly vulnerable and it needs more protection. So this standard, which is internationally recognised as a how-to guide of how to protect food and drink from deliberate attack, will be bolstered with more information on cybersecurity. So if you can go to my last slide and look at the key messages that we're talking about here, we have to stop avoiding this risk and manage it. So let's not wait until it's too late and our entire supply chains break down, because the food industry is incredibly vulnerable. We're used to risk management. It's part of what we've been doing in food safety. We've had independent audits for occupational health and safety, for food safety, all sorts of things for years now. We've certified our supply chains. Extend that same approach to the risk of cyber. Unlike the financial sector, our sector is lagging in the way it's prepared for cyber attack. So we're a particularly soft target because not a lot of food businesses have actually done the hard yards to protect themselves. At a procurement level, we need to risk assess suppliers for the cyber risk that they pose to our supply chain, and make that part of the selection process and ongoing evaluation about how well they manage it, because they are, after all, an input, and there's that co-relationship between the two businesses, or the stream of businesses in the supply chain. Retailers and major brands around the world are now starting to look at their suppliers and have a look at the cyber resilience of the suppliers. And ISO 27000 certification is becoming quite a norm for a supply specification of a supplier. In some cases, it's a competitive advantage. In other cases, it's actually a deal breaker. Without it, you can't supply. I mentioned before that 50% of our processes in the food industry are controlled by software. It makes us very vulnerable. We need to really address that. And so cybersecurity is an organisation-wide issue. It's no one department's responsibility. It's across the board. It's everyone's responsibility. And given that around 95% of incidences are caused by employee error, then cybersecurity training is essential for all staff at all levels. So that wraps up my little piece there. So hand back to you, Trent. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Todd. And I think it's worth emphasising your point there that 50% of processes are controlled by software and therefore, theoretically have that vulnerability. We know of the news story that broke in 2021 about the Florida water treatment plant that was supposedly hacked. And I believe subsequently the FBI came out and said, maybe it wasn't a hack, but certainly that possibility exists, and there might be a few conspiracy theories floating around as to why it would be downplayed. But the question I had for you just while you're there, Todd, because we have just opened for some questions now, and I've got a few here to work through. So thank you for those who have entered them into the question box. So Todd, one while you're already on screen, just on the question about supply chains, and we know, for example, often tenders will now request, if we're bidding for work, it will request ISO 27001 certification. Do you think we'll get to a point where that type of requirement it will certainly be evaluated by retailers and other customers? Could it appear in, as an example, a GFSI standard or a standard elsewhere?
I wouldn't say no. I've not heard talk about it being introduced into, say, GFSI in food safety. We did see cybersecurity enter into some of the GFSI space a few years ago, where BRCGS added it in as an element of requirement, but they didn't really articulate it particularly well about what that meant. So it wasn't necessarily as well delivered as it could have been. But yeah, definitely there are retailers around the world that are requiring that as one of the points of entry for supply. And we ourselves, as a supplier of services, BSI, we are required to have that. So we are independently certified to ISO 27001, not by ourselves, by a separate certification body globally for our own information security management, because that's part of our supply chain. Of course, we don't supply directly into the food industry as such, but we are a supplier to the food industry. So it is an important one. So I would not be surprised if it becomes a requirement, and I wouldn't be surprised if some governments start to legislate a requirement.
Yeah, perfect. And perhaps something we will see is, in the way that we saw, I guess coming back to Dushyant's point at the start of the presentation, was not so long ago maybe we didn't have allergens as a risk that we're considering in HACCP hazard assessments. Maybe we're going to see information security risks considered in that risk assessment matrix in the future as well. So thank you very much for that, Todd. Another question. Sorry.
Just to back that up. Just to highlight the point. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it really should be already, because in food defence, cyber is one of the things. So therefore, as food defence is part of your risk assessment, it really should be already part of the risk assessment. Yeah. Sorry to interject. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Todd. Dushyant, did you have any other comments on that? You're on.
Todd's perfectly outlined what it should.
I did have a question for you to just add on that, if and it might be a good one for you to answer. For obviously online today, we've got some fairly big businesses. We've got some smaller operators as well. For a company on a budget, where would you start with cyber protection?
I think there are a number of tools out there, but the most simplest way is to go through a systematic checklist, a checklist that kind of outline not just controls, because we always focused on controls and focused on hardware and whatnot, but to try and go through and have a checklist which covers the entire part of management system. And the reason why I talk about management system approach rather than talking about control specific area is because the example that Charlie gave was fantastic. The reason why one business that was hacked was able to come back, right, in 13 minutes and do whatever they had to, because they had a system in place to be able to plan and do, check and act and move in a way where they could come back fairly quickly. Although 13 minutes is not quick, but they were able to while the other wasn't. So I think that approach is extremely important, to try and idealize where you are and what are the gaps, and then systematically work through each one of those gaps to try and address. Whether it's from a policy perspective that there are things that you need to amend, you need to have accountability and responsibility. You may have had to have a CISO in place if you don't already, and does that CISO have enough voice at the board level or not? Do you have sufficient budgets to do what you need to do? For planning of infrastructure, making changes to the digitization that you're doing? Are you going through each one of those controls, and how regularly are you doing that? You know, is it once in a couple of years, or once every 2 months, or once a week, or whatnot? And that will vary, but that's a check that's extremely important, and identifying the gaps and systematically addressing those.
Thanks, Dushyant. And Charlie, I might bring you in on that question as well. Do you have any different thoughts to Dushyant on, or the ability to build on his response on where you would start with cyber protection?
Yeah, it was a very good answer. So I'd say similar things, but if you were on an extremely tight budget, which hopefully not many of you are, but I'd start with understanding actually where you are on your cyber journey and where your crown jewels are, in effect, your data, the important bits to protect in your business, and then put some small bits of protection around that. It's about doing the right thing and understanding what's important to you and what a hacker might go after. So that's where I'd suggest people start if they are on a tight budget.
Okay, and from a training perspective, do you have any thoughts about the best way to approach training? We talked about some of the, I suppose, vulnerabilities through individuals before, so that obviously still remains one of the weak points in the system is the person.
Yeah, one thing we're seeing a lot of companies do now that we're helping them with is gamifying it a little bit. So obviously a lot of companies have those just questions you answer and you run through, click next, watch videos and things. But there's some quite good tools that can be used these days to sort of build that culture. We see teams and even boards running board games that have been developed around how they're going to work through the cybersecurity, how they're going to develop, and what the impacts can mean for the business, using some clever AI in the background to do that. And while that's probably top end, and you know what some people are doing, it's the key thing I'd say is make it a bit fun and memorable for your users at the end of the day, because then they absorb it a bit more. Even if it's whoever gets the highest score gets a small voucher, something like that. If it's just the things you're going through, because then it sticks in their minds much better.
Thanks, Charlie. Bernie, I'm just seeing if we've still got you online there.
Certainly have.
Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can't see you, but that's fine. Just a question for you on. Oh, there you are. Perfect. So, a question for you on. I guess, do you have any thoughts on it? Is the risk underappreciated in Australian businesses, large and small? We've obviously seen a lot of breaches in the last 12 to 18 months in Australia. Do you have a thought on, are we lagging behind the rest of the world here, or is everyone somewhat just trying to keep up with dealing with the risk?
Yeah, I think working across boards in 4 different countries, I think we're probably a little complacent. I think fascinating. If you're going to build a house and you want a builder to do it, you'll go and do a reference check on that builder and make sure that they're very good and maybe look at some of their previous work. And yet we're all quite comfortable as a board to take our IT managers' word that we're impenetrable and there's not a problem. So I think firstly, we do underestimate because of the lack of confidence, because of the confidence that we supposedly have in our CIO or our IT head. I think the second thing is that it's like any part of a risk register that a board has to do. If you run a mine, then there's always a problem with the potential caving. If you run an explosive company, there's a problem with the potential explosion going on. And so you put that into the bracket of what is the risk of this happening. You're never going to get 100% defense, and you're never going to get 100% mitigation in your risk register. So it becomes a balance between the spend versus the logic associated and the depth with which you can go forward and protect yourself. And I think finally, there's no doubt that boards throughout Australia are playing catch up. You've also got to remember that a lot of the listed companies in Australia, their board is made up of predominantly grey-haired male and females. And so they're not necessarily techno-tots like me, and they're not necessarily up to date with the latest and greatest technology. But without being smart, I think there's no doubt that you're dealing with a lot of people that don't understand what's going on, and you're dealing with a lot of people that potentially have to get fast track on and get help in that area as well. And that makes it a greater risk than what people think in Australia.
Thank you, Bernie. And Todd, do you have any thoughts on where Australian food businesses might sit? You're dealing with a lot of global food businesses. Do you have any thoughts on where we might be sitting against, you know, for example, European businesses, businesses based in the Americas, or is everyone on the same journey?
Oh, there are certainly differences, and some of the very large global organisations have addressed this because the vulnerability is just so huge for them. But when you start talking about that medium-sized enterprise in the food industry, I think we're actually all the same across the world. There's some that are doing it, but there's lots that are not, and they're just not realising how vulnerable they are. Or if they are, it's a bit like what Bernie was saying earlier, where the chief information officer assures the board that everything's okay, but when they go on to do that penetration testing or the other challenge testing of the systems, they find exactly where the holes in the cheese are. So I think it's important to have that strong message out there. We are a vulnerable industry. We're probably one of the most important, if not the most important industry on earth, and yet we're in this situation where there are some organisations that are a little bit asleep at the wheel, and that's global.
Thanks very much, Todd. And look, that more or less brings us to time. So thank you very much to Dushyant, to Charlie, Bernie and Todd for presenting today. Really insightful discussion. I'm sure there's lots of food for thought, no pun intended, but to take back to the businesses who are in part of the audience today. So just a reminder to everyone, we will be sharing the recording with everyone. Feel free to obviously share it amongst your colleagues as well, and any questions that we didn't quite get to answer, we'll be providing those in addition to the ones that we've just answered as part of the mail out. So sincere thanks for everyone, for our presenters and for our audience today, and look forward to catching you on the next webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Trent. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.